The day started like any other for Marcus Johnson, a man whose polished appearance and quiet confidence often made people take notice. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie that spoke of understated elegance, he walked through the bustling airport with purpose. His leather briefcase swung gently by his side as he approached the gate where passengers were lining up to board their flight. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the nearby cafe, mingling with the hum of conversations and announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. Marcus had planned this trip meticulously. It wasn't just another business journey. It was part of his undercover assignment as a federal auditor, tasked with investigating systemic discrimination in the airline industry. For months, he'd been gathering data, traveling across the country, and observing patterns of bias in how passengers were treated based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Today's flight would be no different. At least that's what he thought before arriving at the gate. As Marcus reached the front of the line, he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, a young woman with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She scanned the ticket and paused for a moment longer than necessary. Her brow furrowed slightly as she glanced between the screen and Marcus's face. Then came the words that sent a ripple through the queue. "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems there's been an error. Your first-class seat has been reassigned." Marcus blinked, surprised but not entirely shocked. He'd heard stories like this before. Stories about black travelers being denied access to premium seating despite holding valid tickets. But hearing about something and experiencing it firsthand were two very different things. Still, he kept his expression neutral, refusing to let frustration show. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and asked calmly, "Could you clarify what kind of error occurred? My ticket clearly states I'm booked in first class." The gate agent shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. "It appears there was a double booking," she said quickly, avoiding direct eye contact. "We've moved you to economy seating instead. I apologize for the inconvenience." Before Marcus could respond, she turned away to assist the next passenger, leaving him standing there with his reissued boarding pass in hand. Around him, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Some passengers exchanged glances while others pretended not to notice. A middle-aged man behind Marcus muttered something under his breath about these kinds of situations, though his tone suggested disapproval more than sympathy. A young couple near the front of the line whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. One elderly woman gave Marcus a sympathetic look, but she said nothing as she shuffled past him toward the jet bridge. Despite the obvious tension, Marcus remained composed. He knew better than to react impulsively. After all, losing his temper wouldn't help anyone. Not him, not the investigation, and certainly not the countless travelers who faced similar treatment every day. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't personal. It was professional. And if anything, this unexpected turn of events might provide valuable insight into the very issues he was trying to uncover. With a slight nod to the gate agent, Marcus stepped aside and joined the queue for economy seating. As he waited, he couldn't help but observe the dynamics unfolding around him. The same gate agent who had refused him entry to first class greeted other passengers warmly, even offering upgrades to some. A white businessman in a rumpled suit breezed through without issue, while a family with children received extra attention and assistance. Each interaction seemed choreographed, yet laced with unspoken biases. By the time Marcus boarded the plane, his mind was already racing with possibilities. Was this refusal isolated, or did it stem from deeper prejudices embedded within the airline's policies? Could it have been a genuine mistake, or was it intentional? These questions swirled in his head as he made his way down the narrow aisle to his assigned seat, a cramped spot near the back of the aircraft. The contrast between the luxurious leather seats in first class and the worn fabric of economy seating was stark, almost symbolic. Settling into his seat, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a notes app. Discreetly, he began jotting down details about the incident, the gate agent's demeanor, the reactions of other passengers, and the overall environment. Every observation mattered, no matter how small. He knew that building a case required patience and precision, and this experience might prove crucial in connecting the dots later on. As the plane taxied down the runway, Marcus gazed out the window, watching the tarmac blur into motion. Despite the circumstances, he felt a flicker of determination ignite within him. This wasn't just about one man being denied a seat. It was about exposing a system that allowed such injustices to persist. And if there was one thing Marcus excelled at, it was turning setbacks into opportunities, for truth, for justice, and for change. Little did he know, this flight would become far more eventful and revealing than he ever anticipated. After settling into his economy seat, Marcus took a moment to collect his thoughts. The narrow space felt suffocating compared to the spacious first-class cabin he had been denied access to, but he refused to let discomfort cloud his focus. Instead, he adjusted his posture, leaned back slightly, and began observing everything around him with sharp precision. This was his chance to gather valuable insights, not just about the incident at the gate, but also about the broader dynamics of how passengers were treated during the flight. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, but already there was a noticeable difference in the level of attention given to various sections of the aircraft. In first class, flight attendants moved gracefully, handing out complimentary drinks and warm towels to passengers who barely acknowledged their presence. Meanwhile, in economy, the same attendants seemed rushed and indifferent, barely making eye contact as they helped stow carry-on bags or answered questions. Marcus noticed one elderly woman struggling to lift her suitcase into the overhead compartment. She waited several minutes before an attendant finally noticed and offered assistance, though not without a hint of impatience. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, Marcus pulled out a small notebook from his briefcase. He scribbled down observations: first-class service attentive, economy neglected. But he didn't stop there. He paid close attention to the interactions between crew members and passengers, noting subtle differences in tone, body language, and effort. For example, when a white passenger in economy asked for a blanket, the request was met promptly with a polite smile. When a black teenager made the same request moments later, the response was curt, "We'll see what we can do," and no blanket ever appeared. Marcus wasn't surprised by these patterns. As a federal auditor, he'd seen this kind of behavior countless times before. What intrigued him now, however, was the sheer audacity of it all. Here he was, sitting in plain sight witnessing blatant inconsistencies that could easily be documented and reported, yet none of the airline staff seemed concerned about being observed, or perhaps they simply assumed someone like him wouldn't dare speak up. To blend in further, Marcus struck up casual conversations with the passengers seated near him. To his left was a middle-aged woman named Sarah, whose weary expression suggested she traveled frequently for work. On his right sat Carlos, a younger man with a laptop open on his tray table, typing furiously. Both seemed friendly enough, so Marcus started with something neutral. "Long flights always feel worse when you're stuck in economy, don't they?" Sarah chuckled dryly. "Tell me about it. I've got elite status with this airline, and half the time they treat me like I'm flying standby. It's frustrating." Carlos glanced up from his screen, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, I've noticed that too. Sometimes it feels like whether you get good service depends less on your ticket and more on, well, other factors." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Other factors? Like what?" Carlos hesitated for a moment, then leaned closer. "You know, things like how you look, how you talk, where you're coming from, or going to. I write about corporate ethics, so I pay attention to stuff like that. And trust me, airlines aren't exactly known for fairness," Sarah chimed in, lowering her voice. "I once saw a family get kicked off a flight because they complained about being treated poorly. They were Latino, and honestly, it felt like the staff went out of their way to make them uncomfortable. People cheered when they left, but I couldn't help thinking it was wrong." Marcus listened intently, filing away every detail. These stories weren't new to him, but hearing them firsthand reinforced the urgency of his mission. Still, he kept his identity hidden, offering only vague nods and murmurs of agreement. "It's crazy how much power these companies have over us," he said carefully. "But sometimes people find ways to hold them accountable. The conversation lulled as the plane leveled off, and the flight attendants began circulating with drink carts. Predictably, the cart moved quickly through, first class, pausing longer at each seat to ensure every need was met. By the time it reached economy, the offerings were sparse and the pace was hurried. When the cart finally arrived at Marcus's row, he decided to test the waters. With a polite smile, he asked for a glass of water. The flight attendant, a different one from earlier, nodded absently and continued down the aisle without acknowledging his request. Moments later, the same attendant stopped abruptly when a white passenger in the next row asked for soda. Within seconds, the man had his drink in hand, complete with a cheerful, "Here you go," from the attendant. Marcus watched silently, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. When the attendant returned, Marcus tried again. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I asked for water a few minutes ago." The attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, sorry about that," she muttered, grabbing a small plastic cup and filling it hastily. She handed it to him without meeting his eyes, then hurried away without another word. Marcus accepted the water with a quiet, "Thank you," though his mind was already racing. He jotted down another note. Selective responsiveness based on passenger demographics. By this point, both Sarah and Carlos had noticed the exchange. Sarah gave Marcus a sympathetic look, while Carlos raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Neither said anything immediately, but Marcus could tell they were piecing things together. That was fine with him. He wanted them to start questioning what they saw, even if they didn't fully understand the bigger picture yet. As the hours passed, Marcus continued his observations, occasionally engaging Sarah and Carlos in light conversation to keep their trust intact. He learned that Sarah worked in marketing for a tech company and traveled extensively for meetings, often encountering similar frustrations. Carlos, on the other hand, was a freelance journalist specializing in exposés about corporate misconduct. His current project involved investigating unethical practices within the travel industry, a fact that made Marcus's ears perk up. "I've heard some wild stories," Carlos admitted during a lull in the conversation. "Airlines manipulating prices, ignoring safety protocols, discriminating against certain groups of people. It's all part of the game for them. But proving it? That's the hard part." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes you just need the right angle, or the right person to shine a light on what's really happening." Carlos tilted his head, studying Marcus curiously. "You sound like you know a thing or two about it." Marcus smiled faintly, keeping his tone light. "Let's just say I've seen my share of unfair treatment. Maybe someday I'll have a story worth telling." For now, Marcus remained focused on gathering evidence. Every interaction, every snub, every act of preferential treatment added another piece to the puzzle. He knew that once the flight landed, he'd have to decide how best to use this information. Would he confront the airline directly? File a formal complaint? Or take a subtler approach, letting the data speak for itself? Whatever he chose, one thing was certain. This flight wasn't just a routine assignment anymore. It was shaping up to be something far greater, a turning point in his investigation, and perhaps a catalyst for real change. As the flight continued, Marcus found himself growing more intrigued by Sarah and Carlos. They were sharp observers, each with their own experiences of unfair treatment in the travel industry. Their insights weren't just anecdotal. They carried weight, backed by personal encounters that mirrored larger systemic issues. Marcus realized that if he played his cards right, these two could become unexpected allies in his mission. But first, he needed to build trust without revealing too much about his true identity. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to flash on overhead. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, gripping armrests or glancing nervously out the windows. The momentary distraction gave Marcus an opportunity to steer the conversation back to the topic of airline practices. "You know," he began casually, "I've been thinking about what you both said earlier, about how some people seem to get preferential treatment while others are ignored. It's almost like there's a hidden playbook they follow." Sarah nodded emphatically. "Exactly. Like I've flown this airline dozens of times and it feels like they only care about me when I'm complaining loudly. Otherwise, I might as well be invisible. Carlos chimed in, leaning forward slightly. And it's not just this airline, it's the whole system. Airlines have figured out how to maximize profits by treating certain customers better than others. If you're rich or look important, you get upgraded. If you're not, well, good luck getting basic service. Marcus listened intently, letting them vent their frustrations. He knew exactly what they meant, but hearing it from different perspectives added depth to his understanding. More importantly, it reinforced the idea that discrimination wasn't isolated, it was pervasive, affecting people across demographics and backgrounds. Deciding to test the waters further, Marcus shared a tidbit of his own experience. "I had a similar situation today," he said, keeping his tone measured. "At the gate, I was told my first-class ticket had been reassigned due to an error. Funny thing is, I didn't see anyone else being moved around. Made me wonder if it was really about the ticket, or something else." Sarah's eyes widened. "Wait, seriously, that happened to you? Did they give any reason?" "Just the usual excuses," Marcus replied with a shrug. "Double booking, technical glitch, whatever works. But here's the thing. I've seen this kind of thing before, not just once either. It makes you question whether it's coincidence or part of a pattern." Carlos raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A pattern, huh? You think they target specific groups of people?" Marcus hesitated for a split second before responding. "Let's just say I wouldn't rule it out. Airlines collect tons of data on passengers, where they're, from how often they fly, even what kind of credit card they use. It's not hard to imagine them using that information to decide who gets priority and who doesn't." The statement hung in the air, prompting silence as Sarah and Carlos absorbed the implications. Finally, Carlos broke the quiet. "If that's true, then it's beyond unethical. It's illegal. There are laws against discriminatory practices like that. Someone should expose it." Sarah nodded slowly. "But who would believe us? Without proof, it's just our word against theirs. And let's face it, most companies like this have deep pockets and lawyers who can spin anything." Marcus leaned, back in his seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's where things get interesting," he said cryptically. "Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to dig deeper, and maybe connect the dots in ways no one expects." His words sparked curiosity in both Sarah and Carlos. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Do you know something we don't?" Marcus chuckled softly. "Not exactly. But I will say this. Patterns leave traces. And if enough people notice those traces, it becomes harder for companies to deny responsibility." Carlos narrowed his eyes, studying Marcus carefully. "You talk like you've dealt with situations like this before. Are you some kind of investigator or something?" For a moment, Marcus considered deflecting the question. But something about Carlos's directness, and Sarah's growing interest, made him reconsider. Perhaps it was time to drop a hint, just enough to pique their curiosity without blowing his cover completely. "Let's just say I've spent years looking into cases like this," he said evenly. "Not always in the airline industry, but the principles are the same. When systems fail, it's up to individuals to step in and hold them accountable." Sarah's expression shifted from skepticism to admiration. "Wow, so you're basically undercover?" Marcus grinned but didn't confirm or deny. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just a guy who pays attention. Either way, I think we're onto something here." Carlos seemed equally intrigued. "Okay, so let's say you're investigating. What's your plan? How do you prove something like this?" "That's the tricky part," Marcus admitted. "It takes evidence, hard evidence, documentation, witness accounts, patterns over time. One incident isn't enough, but multiple incidents? That's where the story starts to come together." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes lighting up. "And you think we could help? Because if there's a chance to make a difference..." Marcus nodded slowly. "Absolutely. You've already shared valuable insights. If you're willing to document your experiences, write down details, take notes, maybe even record interactions, it could add weight to the case, but it has to be done carefully. These companies don't like scrutiny." Carlos smirked. "No kidding. But hey, if anyone knows, How to handle pushback, it's journalists. Count me in. Sarah smiled determinedly. Same here. I may not be a reporter, but I've got plenty of stories to tell. And if exposing this kind of behavior helps other travelers, I'm all for it. With their agreement secured, Marcus felt a surge of optimism. This partnership, though informal, could amplify his efforts exponentially. Together they represented a cross-section of voices: a frequent traveler frustrated by poor treatment, a journalist hungry for a groundbreaking story, and a federal auditor working tirelessly behind the scenes. Each brought unique strengths to the table, and Marcus knew their combined efforts could shine a spotlight on the airline's discriminatory practices. As the plane descended toward its destination, Marcus turned his attention to the final stretch of the flight. He watched as the flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing, noting how their demeanor shifted depending on which section of the plane they were serving. In first class, smiles were wide and gestures were polite. In economy, instructions were delivered briskly, almost dismissively. Even the announcements over the intercom carried a subtle bias, with phrases like "our valued premium passengers" contrasting sharply with the generic economy travelers. When the wheels touched down, Marcus felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The flight had been long, but it had also been productive. He now had not only first-hand observations but also potential collaborators who shared his commitment to uncovering the truth. As passengers began gathering their belongings and shuffling toward the exits, Marcus turned to Sarah and Carlos. "Listen," he said quietly. "This doesn't end here. If you're serious about helping, we'll need to stay in touch. Share what you've seen. Write down everything you remember and keep your eyes open. The more evidence we gather, the stronger our case becomes." Both Sarah and Carlos nodded firmly, their resolve evident. "We're with you," Carlos said. "Whatever it takes." "Good," Marcus replied with a satisfied smile. "Because trust me, this is just the beginning." As they disembarked the plane and stepped into the terminal, Marcus couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with allies like Sarah and Carlos by his side, he knew they stood a fighting chance at exposing the injustices hidden beneath the polished veneer of modern air travel. The flight had landed and passengers were filing out of the plane in a slow but steady stream. Marcus lingered near the exit, allowing Sarah and Carlos to step ahead while he took a moment to gather his thoughts. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him, not just the incident at the gate or the discriminatory treatment during the flight, but the realization that this was more than just an isolated case. It was part of a much larger system designed to favor some while marginalizing others. And now, with two unexpected allies by his side, Marcus felt both empowered and cautious. He knew the next steps would require precision, strategy, and trust. As they made their way through the terminal, Marcus caught up to Sarah and Carlos and suggested they find a quiet corner to regroup. "Let's grab a coffee," he said casually, nodding toward a nearby cafe. "We can talk about what happens next." They agreed, and soon the trio settled into a secluded booth away from the bustling crowds. Over steaming cups of coffee, Marcus began laying out a plan. "First things first," he started, leaning forward slightly. "If we're going to take this further, we need to document everything. Every interaction, every detail, no matter how small it seems. Patterns are key here, and the more evidence we have, the stronger our case becomes." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I've already been jotting down notes in my phone, but honestly, I didn't think it would lead anywhere. Most airlines are so big, they act like untouchable giants. That's exactly why we need to hit them where it hurts," Marcus replied firmly. "Public opinion matters. If we can build a strong enough narrative, people will start paying attention, and when public pressure mounts, even the biggest companies have to respond." Carlos chimed in, his journalist instincts kicking in. "And media coverage is crucial. A story like this could blow up if we frame it right. Discrimination in the travel industry isn't new, but exposing specific incidents backed by solid evidence, that's gold." Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating Carlos's enthusiasm. "Exactly. But timing is everything. We can't rush this. We need to make sure we have all our ducks in a row before going public. The conversation shifted to logistics. Marcus outlined how they could divide responsibilities. Sarah would focus on documenting her own experiences as a frequent traveler, highlighting instances of bias she'd encountered over the years. Carlos volunteered to dig deeper into the airline's policies, using his connections in journalism to uncover internal documents or whistleblower accounts. As for Marcus, he'd continue gathering first-hand observations while analyzing the data they collected collectively. Just remember, Marcus cautioned, this isn't just about one airline. What we're looking at is systemic, a problem that exists across industries. Our goal isn't just to call out this company, but to spark a broader conversation about fairness and accountability. Sarah raised an eyebrow. So, you're saying this is bigger than us? Much bigger, Marcus confirmed, but sometimes change starts with ordinary people standing up and refusing to stay silent. That's what we're doing here. Their planning session was interrupted when a flight attendant approached their table. She introduced herself as Lisa, explaining that she had overheard part of their discussion earlier and wanted to clarify something. Her tone was polite but guarded. I couldn't help noticing you mentioned issues with service during the flight, she said hesitantly. I wanted to assure you that we treat all passengers equally regardless of, well, anything. Marcus exchanged a glance with Sarah and Carlos before responding. That's good to hear, he said smoothly, deliberately choosing his words carefully. But tell me, Lisa, do you think everyone feels that way? Because sometimes actions speak louder than intentions. Lisa blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. Of course we try our best, she insisted. But you have to understand there are protocols we follow. Priorities shift depending on the situation. Protocols, Marcus repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Interesting choice of phrase. So these protocols, they dictate who gets priority seating, who receives timely service, who's offered upgrades? Or is it left to individual discretion? The flight attendant hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. It's complicated, she admitted after a pause. Some decisions are based on loyalty programs, others on operational needs. I'm not privy to all the details. Marcus leaned back in his seat, studying her closely. Fair enough. But here's the thing. When passengers see inconsistencies, when they feel treated unfairly, it creates mistrust. And that mistrust doesn't just affect one flight or one airline, it spreads. People talk, stories get shared, and sooner or later, those stories add up. Lisa nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. I'll pass along your feedback, she said finally. If there's room for improvement, I'm sure management will address it. After she walked away, Carlos let out a low whistle. Smooth move, Marcus. You practically interrogated her without making it obvious. It wasn't an interrogation, Marcus corrected with a wry smile. Just a conversation. But it shows how even frontline staff struggle to defend questionable practices. They're caught between policy and perception. Sarah frowned, her mind clearly processing everything. Do you think she'll actually report this to her bosses? Or will they brush it off like always? Hard to say, Marcus replied. But either way, it doesn't hurt to plant seeds. Sometimes discomfort leads to reflection, and reflection leads to action. With that, they wrapped up their meeting, agreeing to reconvene within a few days to compare notes. As Sarah and Carlos headed off in separate directions, Marcus lingered behind, watching the ebb and flow of travelers around him. Airports were fascinating places, microcosms of society where privilege and inequality played out in real time. For every passenger breezing through priority lanes, there were countless others navigating long lines and cramped seating. It was a reminder of why his work mattered. Back at his hotel later that evening, Marcus opened his laptop and began organizing the day's findings. He reviewed his notes, cross-referencing them with the observations Sarah and Carlos had shared. Already a clearer picture was emerging, one that highlighted consistent patterns of bias and neglect. First-class passengers received preferential treatment not just because of their tickets, but because of implicit biases embedded in the system. Economy travelers, meanwhile, were often dismissed or ignored unless they demanded attention. Determined to keep momentum going, Marcus drafted an email to his supervisor at the Federal Auditing Agency, summarizing the initial findings of his investigation. He attached screenshots of his notes along with timestamps and descriptions of key incidents. "This case has potential," he wrote in the subject line, knowing it would grab their attention. "Further exploration required." Before hitting send, Marcus paused, reflecting on the day's events. Meeting Sarah and Carlos had been fortuitous, almost serendipitous. Their willingness to collaborate gave him hope, not just for this investigation but for the possibility of driving meaningful change. Together, they represented a powerful coalition, a seasoned auditor, a seasoned traveler, and a tenacious journalist. Each brought unique perspectives and skills to the table, turning what could have been a solitary mission into a collective effort. As he finally clicked send and closed his laptop, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance. But for the first time in a long while, he felt optimistic. Change rarely happened overnight, but with persistence and the right allies, it was possible. And Marcus was determined to see this through, no matter how long it took. By the time Marcus met up with Sarah and Carlos 2 days later, the trio had already amassed a surprising amount of evidence. Sitting in a quiet corner of another airport cafe, this one adorned with potted plants and soft jazz playing faintly, in the background, they spread out their findings across the table. Laptops, notebooks, and smartphones formed an eclectic collage of information, each piece contributing to a larger narrative that was beginning to take shape. Marcus opened the discussion by summarizing what they'd gathered so far. "Between the three of us, we've documented over a dozen incidents of discriminatory behavior," he said, his voice steady but tinged with determination. "From gate reassignments to preferential treatment during flights, it's clear there's a pattern here, but we need more than just anecdotes, we need hard proof." Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone to show screenshots she'd taken of text exchanges with customer service representatives after being denied upgrades despite having elite status. "Every time I complained, they gave me the same excuses. System error, protocol, limited availability. It's infuriating because it's always vague enough to avoid accountability." Carlos chimed in, sliding a stack of printed documents toward Marcus. "I reached out to some former airline employees who agreed to speak off the record. One of them confirmed that staff are often encouraged to prioritize passengers based on appearance or perceived value. They call it revenue management, but really it's profiling." Marcus studied the documents carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read through the whistleblower accounts. "This is exactly what we need," he said, tapping the papers lightly. "Internal perspectives add credibility to our case. If we can tie these practices back to official policies, or at least demonstrate how widespread they are, we'll have a strong foundation for an investigation." As the conversation deepened, Marcus decided it was time to reveal more about himself. Leaning forward slightly, he locked eyes with Sarah and Carlos. "There's something you should know," he began, his tone serious yet calm. "I'm not just someone who pays attention to these issues. I'm a federal auditor. My job is to investigate systemic discrimination in industries like this one. That's why I was on that flight and why I'm here now." The revelation hung in the air for a moment, met with stunned silence. Sarah blinked rapidly, processing the news, while Carlos let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "That explains a lot. You're not just passionate about this, you're professionally invested." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "But I couldn't do this alone. What started as a routine assignment has turned into something much bigger thanks to both of you. Your experiences and insights are invaluable. Together, we can expose these practices and push for real change." Sarah leaned back in her chair, visibly impressed. "So what happens next? Do we go straight to the authorities? Or do we try to gather even more evidence first?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "We need to strike a balance. The more evidence we collect, the stronger our case becomes. But we also can't afford to wait too long. Public awareness plays a huge role in cases like this. Once people realize what's happening, it puts pressure on companies to act. Carlos nodded enthusiastically. That's where I come in. I can write an article exposing these practices, using the data we've collected as the backbone of the story. With the right angle, we could turn this into a national conversation. But timing is critical, Marcus interjected. If the airline catches wind of what we're doing before we're ready, they might try to cover their tracks, or worse, retaliate against anyone involved. We need to coordinate carefully. Over the next hour, they mapped out a detailed plan. Sarah would continue documenting her own interactions with the airline, focusing on how loyalty program members were treated differently based on race and socioeconomic status. She also volunteered to reach out to other frequent travelers in her network, asking if they'd experienced similar biases. Meanwhile, Carlos would draft an investigative piece highlighting the systemic nature of the problem, weaving together personal stories, whistleblower testimonies, own observations. Marcus, meanwhile, would compile all the evidence into a comprehensive report for his agency, ensuring that legal avenues were explored alongside public exposure. As they wrapped up their meeting, Marcus emphasized the importance of staying vigilant. This isn't just about collecting evidence, it's about protecting ourselves too. Be careful who you share this with outside our group, and if anything feels off, like someone's watching you or asking too many questions, let me know. Immediately. Both Sarah and Carlos assured him they understood the stakes. Don't worry, Carlos said with a grin. I've dealt with corporate pushback before. They don't scare me. Sarah smiled confidently. And I've got nothing to lose. If sharing my story helps hold them accountable, then count me in. With their roles clearly defined, the trio parted ways, each returning to their respective tasks. For Marcus, the next few days were a whirlwind of activity. He spent hours analyzing the growing body of evidence, cross-referencing dates, locations, and passenger demographics to identify recurring patterns. Every detail mattered, from the language used in official communications to the subtle cues embedded in staff training manuals. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. Meanwhile, Sarah's efforts yielded unexpected results. Several of her contacts came forward with harrowing tales of mistreatment, ranging from denied boarding due to alleged overbooking to outright hostility from staff. One woman recounted how she'd been removed from a flight after questioning why her seat had been given to a white passenger with a lower-tier membership. Another described being ignored by flight attendants for hours during an international trip, despite repeated requests for assistance. Carlos, on the other hand, dove headfirst into his reporting. He interviewed former airline employees, scoured online forums for passenger complaints, and reviewed publicly available data on customer satisfaction ratings. What emerged was a damning portrait of an industry riddled with inequities, where profit margins often took precedence over fairness. His article began to take shape, blending raw emotion with hard facts in a way that promised to captivate readers. A week later, the group reconvened to review their progress. By now, Marcus's laptop contained a treasure trove of material: audio recordings of biased interactions, internal emails detailing discriminatory protocols, and statistical analyses revealing glaring disparities in service quality. Sarah had compiled a list of testimonials from fellow travelers, each one adding weight to their argument. Carlos proudly presented a nearly finished draft of his exposé, complete with headlines designed to grab attention. Airline Discrimination 101, How Bias Takes Flight, and First-Class Treatment for Some. This is incredible, Marcus said, scrolling through the files with a mix of awe and determination. We've built a case that's impossible to ignore. Now, it's time to decide how to present it. They agreed to move forward on multiple fronts simultaneously. Marcus would submit his report to the Federal Auditing Agency, triggering a formal investigation. At the same time, Carlos would publish his article, timed to coincide with the release of Marcus's findings. Sarah, meanwhile, would serve as a spokesperson, sharing her story with media outlets and amplifying the message through social media. Before leaving the cafe, Marcus looked at Sarah and Carlos with genuine gratitude. You two have no idea how much this means. Not just to me, but to everyone who's ever felt powerless in situations like this. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with work like this, we're laying the groundwork for something bigger. Sarah smiled warmly. We're just getting started. Carlos raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To justice, and to making sure no one gets away with treating people like second-class citizens. As they left the cafe and went their separate ways, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, filled with resistance and potential backlash. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for the outcome of this investigation, but for the ripple effects it might create. After all, every movement starts with a single step, and this step was shaping up to be monumental. The weeks following their final meeting were a blur of activity for Marcus, Sarah, and Carlos. Each played their part with precision, knowing that the culmination of their efforts would soon come to light. Marcus worked tirelessly to finalize, his report poring over every detail to ensure it was airtight. He cross-referenced testimonies, analyzed data trends, and included excerpts from internal documents provided by whistleblowers. By the time he submitted the report to his superiors at the Federal Auditing Agency, it was a damning indictment of systemic discrimination within the airline industry, a document so compelling that it immediately triggered a high-level investigation. Meanwhile, Carlos put the finishing touches on his exposé. Knowing the gravity of the story, he chose his words carefully, balancing hard-hitting facts with human emotion. The article wasn't just about statistics or policies. It was about people. Ordinary, travelers who'd been humiliated, ignored, or mistreated simply because of how they looked or where they came from. When the piece went live online, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had thousands of shares across social media platforms, sparking outrage and igniting conversations worldwide. Readers flooded comment sections with their own stories, turning what began as an isolated incident into a global reckoning. Sarah became the face of the movement, speaking openly about her experiences in interviews with major news outlets. Her calm demeanor and articulate explanations made her a relatable figure, someone viewers could empathize with. She recounted the frustration of being passed over for upgrades despite years of loyalty, the indignity of being treated as invisible in economy seating, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness when complaints fell on deaf ears. Her vulnerability resonated deeply, inspiring others to share their voices and demand accountability. As the story gained traction, pressure mounted on the airline to respond. Initially, executives attempted to downplay the allegations, issuing vague statements about customer service challenges and isolated incidents. But as more evidence surfaced and as public outrage intensified, their tone shifted. Facing mounting scrutiny, the airline issued a formal apology, acknowledging that its practices may have fallen short of fairness and equality. It promised sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity training for staff, updated protocols for handling passenger complaints, and independent audits to monitor compliance moving forward. But Marcus knew better than to trust empty promises. Behind the scenes, he worked closely with investigators to ensure the airline's claims were backed by action rather than rhetoric. Testimonies from passengers and employees were corroborated, internal communications were scrutinized, and patterns of misconduct were meticulously documented. The investigation revealed that the discriminatory practices weren't limited to one airline. They were pervasive throughout the industry, embedded in everything from pricing algorithms to employee incentives. This discovery only strengthened Marcus's resolve to push for broader change. The tipping point came when regulatory bodies stepped in, launching inquiries into multiple airlines suspected of similar behavior. News outlets seized on the developments, running headlines like "Air Travel Under Fire, is your seat based on bias?" and "Systemic Discrimination Unmasked. What airlines don't want you to know." Lawmakers joined the chorus, calling for hearings and proposing legislation to hold companies accountable for discriminatory practices. For the first time in decades, the travel industry found itself under intense public and governmental scrutiny. For Marcus, Sarah, and Carlos, the impact was profound. Their collaboration had sparked something far greater than any of them had anticipated, a movement that transcended individual grievances to challenge systemic inequities. They received messages of gratitude from strangers around the world, thanking them for shining a light on issues that had long been swept under the rug. Some even credited their efforts with empowering others to speak out against injustices in their own lives. Yet, amid the accolades and attention, Marcus remained grounded. He knew the fight was far from over. While the initial wave of reform signaled progress, lasting change required vigilance. Policies could be rewritten, but ingrained biases took longer to dismantle. Still, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Sitting alone in his office late one evening, he reflected on the journey, from that tense encounter at the gate to the global conversation now unfolding. It reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place: to give voice to those who felt powerless and to hold institutions accountable for their actions. Sarah and Carlos continued their advocacy work too, each finding new ways to contribute. Sarah partnered with consumer rights organizations to advocate for fairer treatment of travelers, while Carlos expanded his reporting to cover other industries plagued by systemic bias. Together, they proved that ordinary individuals could make extraordinary impacts when they united behind a shared cause. Months later, Marcus attended a press conference held by the Department of Transportation, where officials announced sweeping reforms aimed at promoting equity in air travel. Standing in the crowd, he spotted Sarah and Carlos seated nearby. As the speakers detailed measures such as transparent complaint resolution processes and penalties for non-compliance, Marcus caught Sarah's eye and gave her a subtle nod. She smiled back, her expression one of quiet triumph. After the event, the three met outside, exchanging hugs and congratulations. "We did it," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Not completely, but enough to matter." "Enough to start," Marcus corrected gently. "Change is a process, not a destination." Carlos grinned, his usual humor returning. "Well, I think we've earned ourselves a victory coffee, or maybe something stronger." They laughed, the weight of recent months lifting slightly as they walked toward a nearby cafe. Though the road ahead still held challenges, they faced it together, armed with the knowledge that their efforts had already made a difference. And for Marcus, that was all the reward he needed, a reminder that justice, no matter how elusive it sometimes seemed, was always worth fighting for.